Well, what I have here are a few tips for writers. Just a few things off the top of my head. Um, in terms of one thing, I think many writers should try to establish, and that is some degree of discipline. You have to make sure that the writing is important to you, that you set aside the time to write, that you have a special place to write, to know your writing needs. Some people, for example, might want to take a walk and come back and write. Some people might want to have a diary where they put some things down on paper consistently, but it's the discipline of writing which is very important. Like for myself, I don't like write a poem every day, but I do feel that in some way I am in the process of doing some type of writing, whether that's letter writing, whether that's, taking down notes in terms of, critically reading something, but I am in the process of doing some type of writing. So I think that discipline is very important. And along with that discipline comes the need for writers to do what I would call heavy lifting. The same way, for example, if you're on any sort of team, sports team, that there's a certain discipline and practice that, you need to do if you're going to excel. I was always interested in terms of how a person who is like, say, a musician might spend like maybe 15, 16, 17 hours, rehearsing and going over their scales and stuff, and, before they have a concert. And I was always saying, okay, what is the equivalent to that for a writer? What do I do? Write a sentence over and over? Like a teacher say, well, for punishment, Ethelbert, you're gonna have to write your name on a blackboard. But it is a thing in terms of, okay, if I'm a writer, am I approaching my craft the same way a musician or a painter or any athlete might do? And it gets down to that discipline and a commitment to the fact that you are a writer, you are an artist. And that's very, very important if you're going to assume this mantle and this identity. The other thing in terms of writing, I feel is very important for people to remember is that all of us are part of literary tradition. For me, I'm African American, and so, I draw upon the African American tradition of spirituals and work songs. I want to be able to say, okay, here's Phyllis Wheatley, here's Sterling Brown, and I'm part of that. I was very much aware of that when I was in college. I'm reading Langston Hughes and Claude McKay and Countee Cullen. And it might have been a degree of arrogance, but I said, yeah, I want to be in the books, I want to continue this tradition. And that's also part of my growth and development. I've been very blessed that I've known many writers who were my elders, who I really looked up to. Some of them, when I was a college student, I was reading. Okay, I was reading their work, and then all of a sudden look up and I'm sharing a meal with them. And so when I look at writers that I've got to know, from like Amiri Baraka to June Jordan, I'm very happy in terms of, okay, I honor their work by reading and studying it, but I also honor in terms of the fact that I'm part of the tradition and what they believed in. What they were working, what kept them up should also keep me up. And I just see my work as being part of this cultural bridge. And I tell people, okay, I have to make sure that I go back and realize, okay, there's this bridge that I'm crossing, okay? But then in my own life, I have to make sure that I extend a bridge into what I call the wilderness of my imagination, okay? That I begin to say, okay, I'm going to extend this bridge, okay? So the bridge of the past is the bridge of the future, and for right now, the unknown. But that's one of the things that I feel is very important, that if you are a writer, you have to understand, just like, for example, you're on the earth, this planet, and you realize all of a sudden that you're also part of a universe, okay? And you may not reach certain stars, but you realize that they're there. And what happens is that when you turn away from those stars and you look at the earth, you make sure that you protect the earth, that you nurture it, that you plant things that it can grow. And so that's the same way that you have to operate in terms of literary tradition, knowing that you're part of it. And you should get some satisfaction from that. that, what happens is that you're saying something in your own words, but somebody else was saying a similar thing in their words for that particular time. And so I know that some people like Amir Baraka was very correct when he was talking about African American music, but it applies to literature. It's a changing saying. It's different, but it's the same. And so when you realize the tradition that you are, it's different, but you have an opportunity to contribute to it. The third thing I would say in terms of being a writer, especially a poet, one of the things you have to ask yourself, what makes a poem go? What makes a poem go? And this is where, when you're learning poetry, can you, through reading and study, can you take it apart? Okay, and say, okay, this is the engine. This is how the wheels turn. To be able to have that understanding of a poem, that intricate understanding of it, what makes it go, it's very, very important. And sometimes people say, okay, you'll learn this just like a mechanic, well, you have to open up the hood and look at what's in the car. You get that from reading, but you're not just reading for pleasure. You're reading to say, how does this go? What makes this go? Okay, what gives this the sound? Okay, what do I like about it? Okay, so that's something I would say. And finally, the other advice is something that I remember my friend Jason Schinder, when we taught a class together up at Bennington. We had a person, we would identify someone in our workshop who would be like a little scribe, that whenever somebody made reference to a name, they wrote it down. So at the end of our session, okay, you had like a little anthology of writers, because, you're in a group, somebody can say, oh, this is my favorite writer. And it's, you've probably never heard of a person. And so what happens is that you are building up that sort of encyclopedia. But also, I think in terms of writers, it's very important to build your own poetic dictionary. So for example, if this, you're not in a program, you're on your own, well, then you begin, say, okay, I'm going to say, what's a sonnet? And you say, okay, I'm going to create my dictionary. So I'm going to write my book, what a sonnet is. And then, just like a dictionary, I'm going to give one example. So it might be Shakespeare or whoever, or Gerald Stern. And I have that example. And because I'm writing the dictionary, I become familiar with the poetic term. Okay, I may not write a villanelle, but because it's in my dictionary, I know how it's constructed. And that's, I think, is a very good exercise, that if you're not in a program where teachers are assigning certain, poetic structures and formal forms, that you can do this yourself. You build your own dictionary, and if you won't want to build it, you can, get a dictionary and just begin to read the dictionary in the same way Malcolm X read the dictionary when he was incarcerated. And that's how you learn. And it doesn't mean that you're going to use all the words in the dictionary every time that you see somebody. But what happens is that you realize, in terms of being a good writer, you're familiar with this. And one of the ways that you can really utilize this information, and maybe I'll add this on as another tip, is that you should really take time to review other writers' books. We look at someone like Jimmy Baldwin. Baldwin began, his writing out with like Go Tell on the Mountain. He began by writing book reviews for various magazines. And that writing the review, that critical reading, that expressing a viewpoint helped him become a writer. And sometimes when you're writing book reviews, you're also out writing with a deadline. The editors expect the review to be done by, X date. And so that's another form of discipline. And that type of reviewing is helpful, not just for you, the individual, but it's also very helpful to the field, the community of writers. What I always find is that many times people publish books and they're happy about books, but where's the audience? I know many writers who write, but they don't read other people's work. Themselves, they want you to read their work, but many times they don't read other people's work. And I think that if you're really concerned about the growth of your literary community, when somebody comes out with a new book, you're not just happy about it. You sort of like say, I'm going to read this, and if somebody is really your good friend, really a good friend, you're able to read, critically review that book, and still have a friendship after you express your views. You may not like the book, but what happens is that the person really your friend, they'll say, you know what? No one's telling me this, but you are. So I know you're really my friend. And in that sense, what happens, that reviewing of the book, on a serious note, is what strengthens our community. It means that a book that comes out is not ignored, it's not forgotten, that it is part of this tradition. And so, it's giving back. The same way when I talked about being a literary activist, there's a point in which you as a writer have to make sure that you dig in your pocket, take your little coins or whatever, and make sure that you give back when the literary organization is asking for funds. Because what happens is that these literary organizations may provide a service to people in the field, okay, information, how to find an agent or whatever. And these organizations have to be supported, and they should be supported by writers. So if you are a writer and you are not a member of a literary organization, it's almost as being you're a writer and you don't have a library card. You're not supporting the libraries, okay, which is also a very important part of the literary community, supporting your libraries. But the other thing is, it's important to really support, like the Academy of American Poets, these type of organizations, the Poetry Foundation, that you as a member of the literary community is not like honorary membership where you get the benefits and you don't give anything, but you realize that you give as much as you can give. And you see many times, it might just be how you give support to a political campaign. It might just be $5, okay? You're not giving the 200,000, but just the 5 to 10 to 15. And that's where you're giving to an organization that's going to provide maybe contests, legal services for writers, which is very important. So those are the things that I think are tips, advice, but also just part of what should be part of your knowledge in terms of, if you say you are a writer, you understand these things.